They called it justice. They dressed it in ceremony, wrapped it in law, and made the entire kingdom watch. But Seraphina Vale knew, as the executioner's shadow fell across her face and the crowd roared its approval, that the real crime wasn't hers. The real crime was the one standing on the platform above her, wearing the crown. Alpha King Ronan Blackthorn had condemned his own mate. And the worst part? He believed every word they'd fed him. Drop your city name below. Because where you're watching from, this story is about to change everything you think you know about power, loyalty, and what it costs to survive the people who claim to love you. The scaffold had been built in 3 days. Seraphina noticed that detail the moment they marched her through the eastern gate of the capital square. 3 days. That was how long it had taken Ronan's council to decide her fate, draft the execution order, construct the platform, and schedule the spectacle. 3 days between accusation and death sentence. 3 days between waking up beside the man she had given everything to and standing in chains before every pack lord in the Silver Fang Kingdom. She had stopped crying on the second day. Not because the grief had left her. It hadn't. It sat behind her sternum like a stone wedged between bone, permanent and immovable. She stopped crying because crying was a language they could read. It gave them something to interpret, guilt or weakness or fear. And Seraphina had decided, somewhere between the third interrogation and the moment a council guard shoved a tin plate of cold broth through the slot in her cell door, that she would not give them anything they could use. The capital square held 4,000 people on a market day. Today it held more. They pressed against the temporary barriers shoulder to shoulder, breath fogging in the early autumn chill. Children sat on the stone railing of the central fountain. Pack warriors in ceremonial dress flanked the path from the prison gate to the scaffold steps. She could smell them: wool, iron polish, someone's breakfast bread, the collective sweat of a crowd that had been waiting since before sunrise. The sky above was that particular shade of gray that preceded dawn by about an hour, not fully dark, not yet light, the color of something caught between states. Her wrists were bound behind her with silver cord. She was in the execution whites, a simple linen shift that hit just below her knee. No shoes. The cobblestones were freezing. She felt each one. She walked straight. Behind her, she could hear the boots of the four-guard escort hitting the stones in unison. Around her, the crowd had gone from murmuring to a low, layered sound that wasn't quite silence and wasn't quite noise. The sound of several thousand people holding something back. Some of them watched with cold satisfaction. Others couldn't meet her eyes. A few of the women in the crowd had their faces turned away entirely. She registered all of it without adjusting her expression. At the base of the scaffold steps, she stopped. Not because a guard stopped her, because she chose to. The senior escort, a captain she recognized, a man named Davin, who had once brought her field reports from the northern border when she was still doing settlement work, stepped forward and put a hand on her shoulder. "Keep moving," he said quietly. "I'm going to look at them," she said. "Give me 10 seconds. He didn't answer, but he didn't push her forward either. She turned her face to the crowd, not searching for sympathy, not performing dignity. She was memorizing them. Every face she could reach before the guards forced her up the steps. She was committing them to something deep and cellular, the part of the mind that functions below language. She didn't know why. She wasn't sure she had a future worth storing memories for, but it felt important. It felt like the only thing she had left that was entirely hers. Then she turned back and climbed. The platform was 8 feet above the square, wide enough to accommodate the executioner, 2 council representatives, the herald who would read the formal charge, and Seraphina herself. The drop mechanism had been built into the center. She could see the outline of the trap door beneath a thin layer of black cloth placed there for ceremonial effect. The executioner stood to the left. He was a tall man, masked, which was tradition, though the mask seemed almost absurd under the circumstances. As though the identity of the person doing the killing mattered less than the machinery of the process around it. She knew what the scaffold didn't have. It didn't have an Alpha King. She had scanned the platform the moment she cleared the top step, before anything else. Ronan wasn't there. He was watching from the upper gallery of the council hall, which ran along the northern edge of the square. She could see the balcony from here, the glass doors half open, the dark silhouette of figures standing well back from the railing. She couldn't make out his face. She wasn't sure if that was a mercy or an insult. The herald stepped forward and unrolled the decree. By order of the Alpha King of the Silverfang Kingdom and the judgment of the High Council, Luna Seraphina Vale stands condemned on the following charges: treason against the crown, conspiracy with the Duskmoor Alliance, forgery of military documents, deliberate sabotage of the Iron Gate Treaty negotiations, and the willful undermining of the Alpha Bond for purposes of political manipulation. Every charge was a lie. She knew it. She suspected at least 3 members of the council knew it. She had no way to prove either of these things in the 3 days they had given her. One of the council representatives on the platform, Lord Cassian Veith, silver-haired and precise, the man who had authored the decree, stepped forward and addressed the crowd. The evidence was reviewed by 7 council members and reviewed again by the Alpha King himself. The verdict was unanimous. The Luna's betrayal extended from the earliest months of her bonding, when she established contact with agents of the Duskmoor Alliance and began supplying them with internal kingdom intelligence. The documents recovered from her private chambers confirm this beyond dispute. The documents. She had seen them in the interrogation room, spread on the table like evidence of a life she had never lived. Her handwriting, near enough. Her seal, near enough. Correspondence that tracked, date by date, her alleged communication with Duskmoor generals, complete with intelligence that had appeared in enemy hands during the summer campaign. She had stared at those documents for a long time, long enough to understand the craftsmanship. Whoever had made them had access to her personal seal, samples of her handwriting from multiple periods, and detailed knowledge of the kingdom's internal operations. That last part was the piece that mattered. That was the piece that pointed somewhere specific. But she hadn't been given enough time to point it. "The sentence is death," Veith said, and stepped back. The herald began rolling up the decree. The executioner moved to his position. One of the guards, not Davin, one of the others, pressed a hand to her shoulder to guide her toward the trapdoor. "Hold," she said. The guard kept moving her forward. "I said hold." Her voice came out leveled and flat in a way she hadn't expected. Not loud, but it stopped him. There was a ripple through the crowd. She heard it, a shift in the ambient sound, people recalibrating. Lord Veith turned back to look at her with the particular expression of a man who had anticipated some kind of final outburst and was prepared to endure it briefly. "You want last words," he said. Not a question, more like a scheduling notation. "I want him to hear them." Veith followed her eyeline to the council hall balcony. Something moved behind the glass doors. Seraphina kept her eyes on the upper gallery and raised her voice, not to the crowd, not performing for the square, but projecting directly across the open air at the dark shape behind the glass. "Ronan." The sound traveled. The square had gone quiet enough that it did. "You believed them because it was easier. Because if I were guilty, you didn't have to ask what you missed, what you enabled, what they built while you were looking at me instead of looking at them." "That's enough," Veith said, nodding to the guards. She kept talking. "The men standing beside you right now, the ones who brought you the evidence, who conducted the review, who told you the verdict was inevitable, they built this. They needed me gone, and they used you to do it. You handed them the kingdom, and they handed you a story." A guard grabbed both her arms from behind. She didn't fight it. "You're going to figure that out," she said, still to the gallery. "And I want you to remember that you figured it out too late." The guard moved her to the trapdoor. She felt the cloth under her feet, the slight give of the mechanism beneath it. Her heartbeat had been steady through the whole walk across the square. Now it spiked. Not with fear exactly, but with something more primitive than fear, the body registering what the mind had already accepted. She found Ronan's silhouette behind the glass one more time. She didn't say anything else. She just looked. The lever dropped. Start them. She did not die. That was the part the kingdom would not know for months. The drop mechanism released correctly. The crowd below heard the sound it was supposed to make. What they didn't see, because the executioner's platform blocked the lower scaffold structure from ground-level view, and because the 2 men who saw the rest of it had been positioned there intentionally, was the harness. thin, black, attached at her waist beneath the linen shift by hands that had been doing this kind of work since before she'd been born. The drop caught the harness rather than her neck, and the force of it swung her sideways into the interior of the scaffold structure, where a narrow ledge had been built into the support framing at a precise height. She hit the ledge hard. Her left side took the impact, ribs, hip, elbow. She bit through the inside of her cheek to keep from making a sound. Above her, the crowd was reacting to what they thought they'd witnessed. She could hear it, a low, collective exhale that built into something that wasn't quite cheering and wasn't quite silence. The sound of people processing a conclusion. Hands found her in the dark. 2 men. Neither spoke. One cut the silver cord at her wrists. The other pressed a folded cloth to her mouth, not to silence her, she realized, but as a cloth pad to keep her from breathing through her nose, because they were already moving through the scaffold structure toward the drainage tunnel access that ran beneath the eastern wall. She was shaking. She could feel it in her hands, in her jaw. The body's betrayal, completely separate from her will. She kept moving anyway. The tunnel smelled of standing water and old stone. She couldn't see anything. The men navigating it clearly could. The harness was stripped off her shoulders while they were still moving. Someone pressed a bundle of clothing into her arms. Dark wool, already worn, sized approximately right. She dressed while walking in the dark through water that reached her ankles and was cold enough to make her teeth ache. 60 feet into the tunnel, one of the men stopped and turned back toward her. She still couldn't see him clearly. "How bad is the side?" he asked. "I don't know yet. We've got maybe 40 minutes before the scaffold guard does a structural check. Standard procedure after an execution." He paused. "That's what they documented in the procedure log anyway. We documented it." She understood what he was saying. They had people inside. People who had been building this for longer than she had known it was necessary. "Who are you?" she asked. "People who believe you," the other man said from behind her. She didn't ask anything else. There wasn't time, and some part of her recognized that the answer to that question was more complicated than any version they could give her in a drainage tunnel. They emerged into the eastern quarter before sunrise, through a maintenance grate behind a tannery. The smell hit her like a wall, hide and chemicals and standing wastewater. She breathed through it. There was a covered cart waiting. The driver was a woman, broad across the shoulders, gray-braided, with the look of someone who had been in difficult places enough times that waiting in one had become unremarkable. She didn't say anything when Serafina climbed into the cart bed, just clicked the horse forward. They were through the eastern gate, legitimate papers, legitimate cargo, a routine pre-dawn delivery run, before the sky had finished turning gray. The woman's name was Sable. That was the only name she gave, and she gave it like someone who had chosen it deliberately rather than been born with it. She operated out of a settlement in the mountain territories north of the Ashford line. Technically within the kingdom, technically outside the effective reach of any capital patrol route. She had approximately 15 people, variously skilled, variously motivated, unified primarily by the specific kind of grievance that accumulates in people who have been inside powerful institutions and then expelled from them. 3 hunters, 2 former court scribes, a disgraced medic, somebody who won't tell me their background but is extremely useful in confined spaces, and an ex-council archivist, Sable told her, on the 3rd night, when Serafina's cracked ribs had been wrapped and her fever from the tunnel exposure had come down enough that she could hold a conversation without her thoughts sliding sideways. Why an archivist? Because official documents have patterns, and someone who can read the patterns can tell a forgery from the original, usually. You knew about the documents. We knew they were coming. We didn't know the specifics until they surfaced. Sable set a tin cup down on the edge of the pallet and looked at her straight. We've been watching Veith's operation for about 8 months. You accelerated their timeline, which is why we didn't have more prepared. They moved faster once they decided you were starting to see them. Serafina was quiet for a moment. I wasn't seeing them. No, but you'd started asking questions about the Iron Gate figures. The real figures, not the redacted version the council presented. That was enough. She thought about the Iron Gate Treaty. It had been her project. Settlement boundary negotiations with the Duskmore border pacts, minor enough in scope that nobody had prioritized it. She'd taken it on herself because the communities along the border were genuine, and their grievances were real, and the council had been letting the file sit for 2 years. She had spent 6 weeks reviewing the original financial assessments, the boundary surveys, the security reports, and there had been a discrepancy, a transfer of resources that didn't match the public ledger. She had flagged it internally, quietly, and then 4 days later the first accusation had appeared. The transfer, she said, in the Iron Gate report. That's where the money went, Sable said. The money they used to build the frames, pay the witnesses, buy the forgers. They laundered it through the border assessment budgets because that file hadn't been opened in 2 years, and they expected it to sit for another 2. She paused. Then you opened it. Serafina closed her eyes. The fever had taken some of the edges off the past days, compressed them into a series of images that didn't quite process in sequence. The interrogation room. Ronan's face across the table, not cold, which would have been easier, but something worse than cold. Something that looked like grief already resolved. He had looked at her like she was already gone before any sentence was handed down. He believed them, she said. Not a question. Yes. Completely. Sable didn't answer immediately. Outside the window, a narrow slot, mountain timber, shuttered. The wind had come up and was pushing at the frame. The evidence was built for someone who wanted to believe it, she finally said. Not for a stranger, for a mate who already had doubts. Whatever doubts those were. Serafina opened her eyes and looked at the rough timber ceiling. She and Ronan had been bonded for 3 years. The first year had been what it was supposed to be. Difficult in the way that all consolidations of power were difficult. 2 people navigating the complicated machinery of shared authority, genuine feeling moving underneath and around the official business of running a kingdom. The second year had been better. The third year had been worse. She had felt him pulling back. Not from her specifically, not in the sharp, clear way that suggested conflict. In the other way, the gradual way, the administrative way. Decisions made without consulting her. Briefings she was no longer invited to. Opinions she offered that were received politely and then set aside. She had told herself it was the pressure of the summer campaign. She had told herself a lot of things. They knew what to exploit, she said. Yes. She was quiet again. What happens now? She asked. You heal, then we work. We need more than the Iron Gate discrepancy. That alone might be explained away. We need the full chain, Geekums, documents, witnesses, testimony, something that can't be dismissed in a room full of Veith's allies. That's going to take time. Months, Sable agreed. Possibly longer. Serafina turned her head and looked at the window. Dawn light was starting at the edges of the shutter. Thin, pale, the same gray-to-gold shift that had been breaking over the Capitol Square when she walked to the scaffold. She had been declared dead at dawn. Something about that, not the death, but the dawn, the specific quality of the light, caught in her chest and held. Not grief exactly, something prior to grief, the place where a self takes stock of what it still has to work with. She had her mind. She had her knowledge of the court structure, its personnel, its internal politics, accumulated over 3 years of close proximity. She had her understanding of Ronan, not as her mate, not anymore in that register, but as a leader, his loyalties, his blind spots, his patterns of trust. She had apparently 15 people in a mountain settlement who had risked their lives to pull her out of a scaffold structure. And she had whatever time it was going to take. I need a name, she said. Sable looked at her. If I'm going back into court circles eventually, I can't go as Serafina. I need a name that belongs to somebody who doesn't. Sable was quiet for a moment. Then, Raven. Raven Ashford. Ashford. She tested the weight of it. After the line? After nobody. Names that come from geography are easier to maintain. Nobody can contradict them. Raven. She let it sit. It didn't feel like her yet. That would take time, which was fine. She had a lot of things that were going to take time. Raven Ashford, she said again. Then she turned back to the ceiling and let her eyes close. Her ribs ached in a way that suggested she'd done more damage than the medic's initial assessment. The fever was still there at the edges, pushed back but not gone. Outside, the wind had settled. She had 3 years of a life to dismantle and rebuild into something else entirely. She started with the name. 6 months later, the Northern Territories produced a new face. She arrived in the first town of any size south of the Ashford line on a gray morning in late winter, on horseback, alone. No retinue, no banner. A travel-worn coat the color of smoke, dark hair cut shorter than was fashionable in the capital and longer than was practical for the road, and eyes that most people, on meeting them for the first time, would afterwards struggle to describe precisely. The color, the expression, something about them that made the description feel insufficient. She gave her name at the town's registration post as Raven Ashford, a merchant negotiator out of the Northern Territories, looking to establish trade relationships in the mid-kingdom settlements. The registrar, a tired man with ink-stained fingers who processed perhaps 40 travelers a day, wrote it down without looking up. She took a room at the settlement's only inn, paid for 3 weeks in advance, and spent the first week doing exactly what she had said she would do. She attended the market, she met the traders, she sat in the common room in the evenings and drank the local ale, which was bitter and thin, and listened. People talked freely in front of a stranger when the stranger seemed genuinely uninterested in their politics, and people in the mid-kingdom settlements had plenty of politics to discuss. The summer campaign had drained resources from the border communities. The trade adjustments that followed the Iron Gate negotiations, the official version, the public version, had benefited the capital's merchant class at the expense of the settlement markets. There was a low, persistent anger in these communities that didn't have a clear target yet. She listened to all of it without offering opinions. She was building a picture of what had happened to the kingdom in the months she had been in the mountains, who had benefited, who had absorbed the cost, what the council's decisions had produced on the ground. In the second week, she found the first thread. It came from a former trade courier, a man named Hesk, perhaps 50, who had run supply routes between the capital and the border settlements for 20 years and had been quietly removed from his contract 6 months prior. He mentioned it casually to someone else at the far end of the common room table. Serafina heard the specific details, the timing, the replacement contractor, the name of the council member who had authorized the contract change, and recognized them. The replacement contractor moved goods that weren't listed on his manifest. She knew this because the archivist in Sable's settlement had found his name attached to 3 transactions in the Iron Gate documents. She bought Hesk a drink. He talked for 2 hours. He didn't know what he was handing her. He thought he was complaining to a sympathetic stranger about losing a contract. She thanked him and went to bed and lay awake until past midnight running the new information against what she already had, adding it to a map that was starting to have enough points on it to show a shape. By the end of the 3rd week, she had 3 more names. She wrote them in her own cipher, not the one the council had copied and used in their forgeries, a different one she had developed herself in the months at Sable's settlement, in a small notebook she kept in an interior coat pocket. When she left the inn, she left without announcement. She took the road south. Baskan. The estate of Lord Brenwick sat between the mid-kingdom settlements and the capital's outer ring, technically within capital jurisdiction, practically autonomous. The lord who ran it was a man she knew by reputation only, careful, well-connected, and known for a particular kind of neutrality that meant he hadn't declared himself in any direction strongly enough to make enemies. These were valuable traits in someone who might eventually need to be persuaded. She arrived at the estate's outer gate in the late afternoon and gave her name to the gate guard. Raven Ashford, merchant negotiator. I have information that Lord Brenwick will find valuable. I'm not selling it. I'm offering it. The guard looked at her with the trained skepticism of someone who processed many offers. He doesn't take meetings without prior arrangement. Tell him the offer concerns the Iron Gate discrepancy and specifically the 3rd column in the original assessment figures. She paused. If he knows what that means, he'll take the meeting. If he doesn't, I'm at the wrong estate. The guard went inside. She waited in the cold for 12 minutes. Then the gate opened. Lord Brenwick was a compact man, somewhere between 55 and 65, with a studied vagueness to his expression that she suspected was cultivated. His study was full of books she doubted he'd read, and maps she was fairly confident he had. He looked at her across his desk with something that wasn't quite suspicion and wasn't quite interest. You know about the Iron Gate figures, he said. I know what's in them. I know what was removed from them. And I know whose name appears in the entries that were removed. He was quiet. Where did you come from? He asked. North of the Ashford line. That's what they're saying in the settlement. That's accurate. And before that? She met his eyes and let a beat pass. Somewhere I couldn't stay. He studied her for a long moment. Then he picked up the cup of something on his desk and drank from it and set it down and looked at his maps. What do you want? Access. Information. Eventually an introduction. She let that sit. I'm not building anything against Ronan. I want to be precise about that. I'm building something against the people who have been operating around him. Those are the same people, Brenwick said, not for much longer. He looked at her again. That not quite suspicion and not quite interest had shifted slightly. She couldn't tell toward what. What's in the Iron Gate figures, he asked. A transfer of 400,000 marks through a border assessment sub-account to a private intermediary connected to 3 council members. Specifically, Veith, Aldmore, and a third party whose name I'm still confirming. The name that shifted his expression was Aldmore. She watched it happen. A small adjustment around the eyes. A particular stillness. Aldmore, he said. Does that change the meeting? He was quiet for a moment, then, stay for dinner, we'll talk more. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a dismissal. She recognized the space between those two positions. It was exactly where she needed to be. She had been Raven Ashford for 6 months. In that 6 months, she had healed, rebuilt again. She had learned a different way to move through rooms, a different register for her voice. She had learned to keep Seraphina's information while wearing Raven's face, to think in 2 layers simultaneously, who this person in front of her thought they were talking to, and what Seraphina Vale knew about them. It was exhausting. It was also, she had discovered, something she was genuinely good at. She sat in Lord Brenwick's estate and ate his dinner and talked trade routes and supply chain adjustments for 90 minutes without once revealing anything that mattered. And at the end of the meal, when he leaned forward and asked her directly how she knew about the Iron Gate figures, she set down her fork and looked at him levelly. Because I read the original documents, personally, before they were modified. That's not possible, he said, but that file was restricted to the Luna's office and... He stopped. She watched him get there. She didn't hurry it. His face was doing something complicated. That's not possible, he said again, quieter this time. I know, she said. He sat back. His hands, on the table, had gone very still. The Moon Summit is in 4 months, she said. I need to be inside it. I need every Alpha and Luna in the realm in one room. She met his eyes. And I need someone to get me there. The silence stretched between them long enough that she could hear the fire in the grate and the distant sound of horses in the outer yard. Brenwick's jaw worked slightly. He was a careful man, a neutral man, a man who had survived by not declaring himself. If you're wrong, he finally said, or if this is something else, if you're an agent of Duskmoor, if this is a play of some kind, I'm not. I'd need more than your word. You'll have it. She paused. I've spent 6 months building it. He looked at her for a long time. Something in his expression had changed. She could see it, the thin edge of a decision forming behind his eyes, cautious and irreversible. Then, from the corridor outside the study door, boots hit the floor. Hard. Fast. More than one set. Brenwick stood up so quickly, his chair scraped back. That's not my household staff, he said. Seraphina was already on her feet. The study door opened. In the doorway stood a man she knew. She knew his build, his posture, the specific way he held himself when he was walking into a room he intended to control. She knew him the way you know something that has been beside you for 3 years, something your body had catalogued without being asked. Captain Davan Reith, Ronan's head intelligence officer, standing in Brenwick's study doorway with 6 men at his back and an expression that was trying very hard to look routine and failing at it completely. His eyes found her face, and stopped. He had never met Raven Ashford, but she watched his body react. A very small, very controlled adjustment, a sharpening of focus that had nothing to do with a merchant negotiator from the Northern Territories. Lord Brenwick, he said, and his voice was perfectly calibrated. We've had reports of a woman matching a specific description operating in the mid-kingdom settlements, making inquiries, meeting with former court contractors. His eyes had not moved from her face. I'll need to ask your guests some questions. Serafina held his gaze and did not let anything reach her expression. 4 months to the Moon Summit. The evidence was still incomplete. The third name, the one behind Veith and Aldmore, the one she was still confirming, was still out of reach. Brenwick was still half a step from being an ally, and Ronan's intelligence captain was standing 10 feet away, looking at her face with the specific expression of a man who was not yet certain, but was very, very close. She smiled at him. Raven Ashford's smile, measured and polite and giving absolutely nothing away. "Of course," she said. "I'm happy to answer whatever you need." And inside that smile, behind it, in the place where Serafina Vale was still very much alive and counting every variable in the room, she understood that she had run out of the safe months. Everything that came next was going to have to be faster. Reith didn't sit. That was the first thing she clocked. Brennick had offered chairs, his instinct for hospitality running on muscle memory even with 6 armed men crowding his study. And Reith had waved it off without looking at him. He stayed standing. He stayed between her and the door. And he kept his eyes on her face with the specific quality of attention that wasn't accusation yet, but was building towards something. She knew his method. She had watched him work 3 times in the capital. 2 interrogations of border informants, 1 debrief of a compromised trade courier. Reith operated through patience. He created silence and let the other person fill it. Most people filled it badly. She had no intention of filling it at all. "Name," he said, "Raven Ashford." She said it the same way she'd said it at every registration post and in-desk for 6 months. Level, unremarkable, a fact about herself that she happened to be sharing. Origin, Northern Territories, above the Ashford line. Pack affiliation. Independent, I work trade routes. I don't carry pack membership the way a warrior does. Reith nodded slowly. Behind him, his men had spread out. 2 near the window, 2 flanking the door, 2 positioned at angles that covered the room's corners. Not aggressive formation, containment formation. She noted all of it in her peripheral vision without letting her eyes move to check. "What brought you to Lord Brenwick's estate?" he asked. "Trade conversation. I've been working the mid-kingdom settlements for 6 months. Lord Brenwick's estate manages a significant portion of the regional supply contracts. It's a logical meeting." "Who arranged it?" She paused. Just a beat, calibrated. Not hesitation. Calculation, visible enough to seem like honesty. "I did. I sent a message ahead through the settlement post. His steward confirmed." Reith looked at Brenwick. Brenwick, to his credit, held the look without flinching. "She sent word 3 days prior," he said. "Standard inquiry." Reith came back to her. "What's your business with former court contractors?" She felt the shift in the room's temperature. That question meant he knew more than a general report. That question meant someone had been tracking her movements in the settlements with enough precision to identify specific conversations. She kept her expression the same. "I talked to everyone in the supply network," she said. "Former contractors know the regional pricing better than active ones. They have less incentive to inflate." "Hesk," Reith said. "Among others." "Hesk was removed from his contract for cause." "He was removed from his contract," she said. "The cause is something people discuss differently depending on who you ask." Reith was quiet. She watched him process that. The small refusal to simply agree. The implication without the statement. He was good at reading subtext. That was what made him valuable to Ronan. It was also what made this moment the most dangerous she'd been in since the scaffold. "Where are you staying?" he asked. "I'd planned to take a room here tonight, given the hour." She glanced at the window. Fully dark now, the hour past what would make road travel reasonable. "If Lord Brenwick will still have me." Brenwick's voice was careful. "Of course." Reith looked between them. Something in his posture hadn't resolved. She could see it, a decision suspended, balanced between the weight of what he thought he recognized and the absence of anything he could name. "I'll need your travel documents," he said. "Standard verification. She reached into her coat and produced the papers. They were excellent. Sable's former court scribes had made them over 3 months, working from originals, building a history for Raven Ashford that went back 4 years. Merchant license, PAC independence declaration, territorial transit records, all of it cross-referenced and internally consistent. Reith took the documents and read them slowly. He wasn't reading for content. He was reading for pattern, the kind of reading that looks for what's slightly off, the way a word is weighted on a page, the ink saturation of a date stamp. She watched his hands while he read. They didn't tighten. He handed the documents back. How long do you plan to be in the Mid-Kingdom region? Through the end of the season, possibly longer, depending on what the summit produces for trade negotiation. The Moon Summit. It moves a significant volume of interpack commerce, she said. Agreements made there drive 6 months of contracts afterward. I have professional interest in being present for it. Reith looked at her for a long time. The fire in the grate shifted and popped and settled. Outside, a horse moved in the yard. I may have additional questions, he said. Don't leave the region without notifying the nearest garrison post. Of course. He gave Brenwick a short nod. He gave her nothing, just took his men and walked out, boots in the corridor, the outer door, the yard. She stood where she was until the sound of horses had moved away from the estate walls and the distance had absorbed them. Then she sat down. Not because her legs gave, they didn't. Because it was the most natural thing to do after a long evening of conversation, and she was still performing for Brenwick, who was watching her from across the room with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. He didn't know, Brenwick said. No. But he suspected something. He suspected a category, she said. He didn't have a specific yet. She set her hands on the table. They were steady. She noted that with something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite relief. He'll do records checks. The documents will hold. Brenwick crossed the room and poured 2 cups of something from the decanter on the sideboard and set one in front of her. He sat down heavily. I'm going to ask you directly, he said. Go ahead. Are you who I think you are? The fire shifted again. The room was very quiet. She looked at him. What do you think you know? I think I know why you understood the Iron Gate figures personally. I think I know where you've been for 6 months. And I think I know why Reith's eyes went strange when he looked at you. He picked up his cup and didn't drink from it. I also think that if I'm right, this conversation is the most dangerous one I've had in a long time. Then you should be very careful about what you decide next. I know that. He finally drank. Which is why I'm asking directly. So I can decide knowing the truth rather than deciding on a suspicion. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, yes. The word landed in the room like something placed rather than spoken. Brenwick put his cup down. His hands, on the table, were not as steady as hers. They declared you dead. They declared a death. It's not the same thing. He was quiet for a long time. She let him be. She had learned, in 6 months of this kind of work, that the most important decisions people made happened in silences that you didn't interrupt. The Moon Summit, he finally said. I need to be inside it, credentialed, visible enough to have the floor when I need it. As Raven Ashford. Until I don't need to be anymore. He looked at her, and she watched something settle in him. Not courage exactly. More like the particular resignation of a man who has recognized that the choice he wanted to avoid has already been made for him by the fact of what he knows. I can get you credentialed as a trade representative, Bian, he said. It won't give you the floor in the formal sessions. It'll get me inside. I'll handle the floor myself. He nodded slowly. Then, if this goes wrong, it won't go wrong in a direction that leads back to you, she said. When it goes right, you'll want to have been part of it. He looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up his cup again. Get some sleep, he said. We'll talk logistics in the morning. She didn't sleep. She lay in the room they'd given her, a guest room, solid and cold, a fire built up but not yet pushing heat into the walls. And she ran the evening through her mind the way she'd learned to run anything that mattered, forward and backward, every angle. Reith had not recognized her. She was confident in that. The hair was different. The face had lost weight during the fever months and changed its proportions slightly. She held herself differently, not as a conscious performance, but as a genuine structural change, something that had happened in the tunnel and the mountain settlement and the 6 months of becoming someone else. She had watched herself in enough reflective surfaces to know that Raven Ashford did not move like Seraphina Vale, but Reith had flagged her, not on specifics, on something more instinctive, the way she'd held the silence, maybe, the precision of her answers, something in her eyes that she couldn't fully control because it wasn't about performance, it was about what was actually there. She needed to be more careful. She needed to be, if anything, slightly less precise. A real merchant negotiator from the Northern Territories would have been nervous, would have filled a few of those silences with something small and unnecessary. She had been too contained. She filed that away. Then she thought about the Moon Summit. 3 months out, roughly. Brenwick's credentialing would get her inside. What she needed from inside was time, positioning, and the complete chain of evidence before she made a move. The Iron Gate discrepancy was solid. The contractor connections she'd built in 6 months of settlement work were solid. The third name, the one linking Veith and Aldmore to whoever had engineered the execution itself, was still the gap. She thought about the third name the way she'd been thinking about it for 4 months, carefully, without assumption. The forgeries had required inside knowledge that went beyond what a council member could access alone. The specific documents that had been copied, her correspondence, her seal, her handwriting from particular periods, were documents that had been in the Luna's private archive, not in the council's records. In her archive. Which meant someone with direct access to her rooms, her files, her personal correspondence, someone in her household. She had been avoiding that conclusion because it required her to think about specific people and specific trust and what it cost when that trust turned out to have been misplaced. She lay in the cold room and let herself think about it now. Fully. Without flinching away. Her household staff had been vetted by the council on her behalf, because that was how it worked. The Luna's household was nominally her domain, but the initial vetting ran through council security. She had accepted that because it had seemed standard. She had accepted a great many things that had seemed standard. She started building a list in her mind. Access. Opportunity. Timeline. Who had been in her archive room? Who had reason? Who had benefited from her removal? By the time the fire had burned down to coals, she had narrowed it to 3 possibilities. One of them she didn't want to be right about. She set that name aside and kept the other 2 as the working theory. She would need someone inside the current capital court to verify. She would need eyes she could trust inside Ronan's household. She thought about Ronan. She did this rarely, not because it was too painful. It was in a technical sense, but pain had become something she worked with rather than avoided. She thought about him rarely because thinking about him required her to hold 2 versions simultaneously. The version she had known, and the version that had stood behind glass at dawn and watched them put her in the ground. She was not angry at him the way she had been in the first weeks. The fever and the mountains and the work had done something to the initial heat of it, burned it down to something cooler and more durable. What she felt now was more specific than anger. It was the recognition that she had built 3 years of herself around a person who had not, in the end, chosen her when the evidence got complicated. She had made it easy for them by loving him in a way that made her legible, her grief when he pulled back, her effort to close whatever was opening between them, her fingerprints, emotionally, all over the last 6 months of their bonding, and all of that legibility had been used, had been read and cataloged and factored into the architecture of her destruction. She would not make herself legible like that again. That was not a decision she made. It was something she noticed had already happened, the way you notice a scar that is finished forming. She left Brenwick's estate in the morning with a handshake and a timeline and 3 names that he had, carefully and with significant hesitation, given her access to. Pack lords with grievances against the current council structure. People who might listen. People for whom Seraphina Vale's execution had not sat cleanly. She spent the next 6 weeks moving between them. She was Raven Ashford in every room. A trade negotiator with very specific knowledge of very specific financial irregularities, offering nothing but information, asking for nothing but an open ear and eventual presence at the Moon Summit. She was patient. She was precise. She did not tell anyone who she was. By the 5th week, she had 3 confirmed allies and 2 probables. By the 6th, 4 confirmed. And then Sable sent word. The message came through the Northern Post, encoded in the cipher they had developed, embedded in what looked like a standard supply inventory request. She decoded it in her room at an inn in the Mid-Kingdom's eastern quarter and read it twice before she allowed herself to process it. Sable had found the third name. Not one of the two she'd been tracking. Someone else. Someone she hadn't considered because considering it would have required her to question something she'd treated as a fixed point. She sat with the name for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the floor of the room. She didn't move. Then she folded the message, burned it in the small lamp flame, and sat in the dark for another few minutes before she lit a new lamp and started writing. Done. The Moon Summit opened on a clear morning in what passed for late-season warmth in the Mid-Kingdom territories. The Summit Hall was a structure that had been used for interpack governance for 3 generations. Stone, formal, built for ceremony, and long enough to accommodate every Alpha, Luna, and credentialed representative in the kingdom. She arrived early. She stood in the credentialed assembly area in Raven Ashford's worn coat and watched the formal delegations enter through the main hall doors. She counted pack banners. She located, one by one, the people she had spent 6 months building toward, and she watched the royal delegation enter. Ronan came in with his council flanking him. Veeth on the left, 2 others on the right, and behind them the broader formal retinue. She had not seen him in 8 months. She had a version of him in her head built from memory, and she had known that version and the real version would not match exactly because memory compressed things and people changed. He looked older, not in a way that time alone produced, in the specific way that worry produced, the small permanent tensions around the jaw and the eyes. He was still carrying himself with the same physicality she knew, the particular weight of a man who had been trained to occupy a room and had been doing it long enough that it was simply how he stood. But something in his expression, when he wasn't performing the formal function of the entrance, was different. She watched him scan the room the way leaders always scanned rooms. Automatic, professional, the eyes moving across faces and registering. His gaze passed through the credentialed assembly area, passed through her, continued on. She felt nothing she hadn't anticipated, which was its own kind of answer. The summit's first session ran for 3 hours. Trade issues, border disputes, infrastructure assessments. She sat in the credentialed gallery and paid attention to all of it, not because the content mattered to her specifically, but because the order of priorities revealed something about whose concerns were being centered and whose were being set aside. She noted the council's interventions, which proposals Veeth's people shaped, which they blocked, which they redirected in ways that were technically responsive and substantively hollow. During the midday break, she moved. She had 40 minutes. She knew the building's layout from summit records she'd obtained through Brenwick's administrative contacts. She knew which rooms were used for private delegation conversations during break periods. She knew where Ronan would go. She did not go to him. Not yet. Not directly. She went to find the room where his personal advisor was spending the midday break, a man named Corvin, who had replaced the original head advisor when that role had shifted 8 months ago. Corvin was not part of the conspiracy. She was reasonably certain of this. What he was isolated. A new appointment in a court full of entrenched people, handling a role that gave him proximity to the king, but not the informal trust networks that made proximity meaningful. She knocked at the correct door. An aide opened it. "Raven Ashford," she said, "I have a brief message for the advisor. It's not a petition. It's a professional courtesy regarding a financial matter he'll want to know before the afternoon session." The aide went inside. She waited. The hallway was quiet. Break period. Most traffic moving toward the dining hall. The door opened again and Corvin looked at her. He was younger than she'd expected. Somewhere in his late 30s, slightly overwhelmed by an appointment he'd been given without adequate preparation. "What financial matter?" he said. She looked at him directly. "The Iron Gate assessment, specifically the 3rd column in the original figures, before the revision." Corvin's face went still. Not guilty, still. Confused still, then alarmed still. He knew the Iron Gate assessment. He hadn't known there was an original pre-revision version. "Inside," he said, and stepped back. She had 12 minutes left in the break period. She used 9 of them. When she walked back out into the hallway, Corvin was standing in his doorway watching her go with the expression of a man who has just had a door open in front of him that he hadn't known existed and is now trying to decide whether to walk through it. She didn't look back. The afternoon session opened. She returned to the credentialed gallery. The formal agenda moved through 2 more items. Then Lord Veith rose. He rose with the comfortable authority of a man who expected rooms to orient around him when he stood, and he presented, to the full assembled summit, a proposal regarding the formal restatement of the Iron Gate Treaty. She watched Ronan's face while Veith spoke. Attentive, neutral, following the presentation. And then Veith, with the smooth precision of something that had been planned for longer than she had been watching him, produced a document. The original treaty assessment, he said, has been audited for accuracy. The revised figures have been confirmed by independent review. He set the document on the formal presentation table. I propose the revision be entered as official kingdom record. The assembled room murmured. Not in objection, in the procedural sound of a bureaucratic motion moving through its expected channels. Seraphina's hands, in her lap, were completely still. That document on the table was the revised version, the one that had removed the 3rd column. If it was entered into official summit record, it would create a formal chain of documentation that would make the original figures look like the forgery. They were moving to close the gap. She had 3 months left before the summit's end. She had 4 confirmed allies in the room. She had evidence that was solid, but not yet complete. They were forcing her timeline. She looked at Veith at the presentation table. She looked at the document. She looked at Ronan, who was nodding, slightly, the procedural nod of a man approving a routine administrative motion that had been framed to him as exactly that. Then Lord Breveth, one of the names she hadn't fully confirmed, one of the 2 she'd been tracking, a man who had been quiet through the entire first session, stood up and placed a 2nd document on the table beside the first. Before this motion is entered, Breveth said, and his voice had a quality in it that she had not heard from him before, the quality of a man who has decided to burn something down and has reached the point where the decision is irreversible. The summit should see the documents recovered from the former Luna's chambers. The room went very still. These are the original correspondence files, Breveth said, presented here as evidence that the treaty figures were deliberately falsified by the former Luna's office, not by any council revision. This establishes the revision as legitimate correction of a corrupted original. Seraphina's chest was absolutely calm. Everything outside her chest was very loud. He was not exposing the conspiracy. He was completing it. He was using the summit itself, every Alpha and Luna in the realm in one room, to cement the final layer of the frame, to enter it into the highest possible official record, to make what had been done to her permanent and unassailable. She looked at the document he had placed on the table. She recognized the seal on the cover page. She recognized the format. She had spent enough time, enough months, with the archivist and the forgers-turned-investigators to know exactly what she was looking at. And she knew, with a cold and absolute certainty, that if she did not move in the next 30 seconds, that document was going to be entered into summit record, and the window she had been building toward for 8 months was going to close permanently. 30 seconds. She stood up. She stood up, and the room turned to look at her. Not all at once. The way a room turns when something unexpected happens in a formal setting, a ripple, starting closest to her and moving outward, heads rotating, attention redirecting, the procedural murmur cutting off mid-syllable. The herald at the front of the hall paused with his pen above his ledger. Breveth, still standing at the presentation table with his hand on the document, turned. Veith turned last, and his eyes, when they found her, went very still. She was in the credentialed gallery, not the floor. Credentialed representatives did not have speaking rights in formal sessions. That was reserved for pack lords, alphas, and designated council voices. She knew this. She had known it when she stood up. She stood up anyway because the alternative was watching 8 months of work get buried in official record while she sat with her hands folded. "I have a procedural objection," she said. Her voice carried. The hall had good acoustics, stone and timber, built for speeches. She did not raise her voice beyond what the room required. The session moderator, an elderly pack lord named Thesson, who ran the summit's formal proceedings with the exhausted precision of a man who had been doing it for 20 years, looked at her over the rims of his reading lenses. Credentialed representatives don't hold floor rights in formal session. I'm aware. I'm requesting an exception on grounds of material relevance to the document being entered. On whose authority? My own. She paused one beat. And on the authority of the information I carry, which the summit will want to have before that document becomes official record. The room was very quiet now, not the procedural quiet of business being conducted, the different quiet of several hundred people recalibrating. Thesson looked at Breveth. Breveth's expression had not changed. He was too experienced for that. But something in his posture had shifted, a fractional tightening across the shoulders. He looked at Veeth. The look lasted less than 2 seconds and communicated something she couldn't fully read from her position in the gallery, but could feel the weight of. The summit does not recognize, well, Veeth began. Let her speak. The voice came from the royal table. Ronan had not moved from his seat. He was looking at her from across the hall with an expression that she could not, from this distance, fully parse. Not recognition. She was certain of that. Something else. The particular attention of a man who has encountered something that doesn't fit the pattern his mind has built and is not yet sure what to do with the mismatch. Veeth turned to look at the king. A very precise silence passed between them. It's a procedural matter, Ronan said to Thesson. Grant the exception. If the information isn't relevant, we enter the document and move on. Thesson made a note in his ledger with the expression of a man adding to a list of things that were not his fault. The floor recognizes the credentialed representative. State your name and affiliation for the record. She stepped out of the gallery and walked to the floor. The distance was perhaps 40 feet. She covered it at a pace that did not hurry and did not perform. Just walked, the way she'd learned to walk through rooms that were watching her, the way she'd been practicing since before she remembered it was practice. Her coat was worn at the elbows. Her boots were travel-stained. She had not dressed for this because she hadn't known, this morning, that she would be standing here today. That, she thought, was actually better. She reached the floor and turned to face the room. Raven Ashford, she said to Thesson's ledger. Trade representative, Mid-Kingdom Territories. My objection concerns the provenance of both documents on the table. She looked at the room as she spoke. Not at Breveth, not at Veeth. At the pack lords and alphas in the formal seats, the people who had come here for governance and were now watching something else entirely unfold. The document Lord Breveth has presented as recovered correspondence from the former Luna's chambers cannot have been recovered from those chambers, she said, because the documents it purports to be are forgeries, and I can demonstrate that with the original figures, the original financial trail, and 3 witnesses currently in this building who can verify the chain of custody for the real Iron Gate assessment. The room broke open, not into chaos, into the particular noise of several hundred people reacting simultaneously, some in objection, some in demand for clarification, some simply in the involuntary sound that comes out of people when something they thought was finished turns out not to be. Breveth's hand came down flat on the presentation table. This is procedurally invalid. This representative has no— Bring the witnesses, Ronan said. His voice cut through the room noise the way it always had, not by volume, by quality, the particular compression of authority that his voice carried when he meant something without performance. The room went quieter. He was looking at her. She looked back. Bring the witnesses, he said again. And the original figures, if they exist. He paused. If they don't, the document is entered and we move on. It took 40 minutes. Thesson called a formal recess. The hall broke into clusters. Pack lords with their advisors, council members with their own people, the ambient noise of a building full of political animals processing a development none of them had been briefed on. She stood near the presentation table and watched the room move and kept her breathing even. Sable's people brought 3 witnesses through the summit's side entrance. The former archivist, a retired border assessor who had handled the original Iron Gate figures before the revision, and a woman named Petra, a former council records clerk who had been the one to process the revision order and who had kept, for reasons she had described to Serafina as simple professional habit, A copy of the original document in a personal file she maintained off-site. She had spent 6 months finding Petra. The archivist had known about her, getting to her, verifying her, persuading her. That had taken 4 of those 6 months. Petra was 53 years old and looked like someone had been frightening her consistently for 8 months, and she had decided recently that she was tired of being frightened. She walked into the summit hall with her file under her arm and her jaw set, and Serafina, watching her come through the side door, felt something in her chest that was close to gratitude and too raw to be comfortable. She didn't let it show. The recess ended. The room reassembled. The San called order with the look of a man who had completely abandoned any expectation that this summit would proceed normally. The 3 witnesses were presented to the floor. The original documents were laid beside the revised version and Brevith's recovered correspondence. The archivist spoke for 12 minutes in the measured and precise language of someone who had spent 30 years working with documents and knew how to explain their significance to people who hadn't. He walked through the differences between the original Iron Gate figures and the revision. He identified the specific entries that had been removed. He traced the financial trail those entries represented. The room was absolutely quiet during most of it. Petra spoke for 8 minutes. She presented her copy of the original document with the revision order attached. The order that bore Vieth's signature and a date that placed it 11 days before the formal charges against the former Luna had been filed. 11 days. The conspiracy's internal timeline, written in administrative ink. When she finished, the border assessor corroborated the figures from his own records. Then Thesan, looking at the documents arrayed on the table, asked the room if there were questions. What followed was not a question. It was Ronan standing up. He stood with his hands flat on the royal table and he looked at Vieth. And the look on his face was not the procedural neutrality he had maintained through the witness's testimony. It was something that had no formal name in the grammar of governance, something prior to decision, something that lives in the body before the mind has fully caught up. "Explain it," he said to Vieth. Vieth's composure was extraordinary. She had to give him that. Decades of court politics had built something in him that did not crack under a room full of witnesses and a table full of contradicting documents. His voice was level. His posture was controlled. "The figures have been selectively presented," he said. "Context that is missing from this account would show—" "Explain the date on the revision order," Ronan said. "Administrative timing is not 11 days. Ronan's voice had not risen. It had gone the other direction. Compressed further, stripped of everything except the core of it. 11 days before the charges. You had already revised the figures before the investigation began, before there was an investigation to justify a revision." Vieth's mouth opened and closed once. It was the first time she had seen anything in him that resembled uncertainty. There were concerns prior to the formal— "Stop!" Ronan turned away from him. The turn was a dismissal, physical, complete. The kind that communicated something that words in formal session couldn't. He looked at the room, at the pack lords, at the summit witnesses. His jaw was working in that way she recognized from 3 years of watching him process things that didn't have good solutions. Then he looked at her. She stood on the floor of the summit hall in her worn coat and held his gaze. She did not give him anything. She did not soften it or explain it or reach for him across the 30 feet of stone floor between them. She simply looked. "Who are you?" he said. Not a question, not quite. "Someone with documentation," she said, "and 3 months of verified witness testimony, and a financial trail that goes from the Iron Gate assessment through a private intermediary to 3 members of your council." "That's not what I asked." The room had gone very still. The particular stillness of people who realize they are watching something that is not, at its core, about documents. She looked at him for a moment longer, then she said, "I know." And she said nothing else. He held her gaze. Something moved through his face. She watched it, the way she'd watched his face for 3 years, the specific muscle patterns of him working through something that he didn't have words for yet. His hands were still flat on the table. He was breathing deliberately. Then Brevith moved, not toward the table, toward the side door. The movement was small, barely a step, barely a shift of weight, and it lasted exactly as long as it took 2 of Brenwick's men, positioned by arrangement at that door since morning, to close in from either side. Brevith stopped. His face, when he turned back to the room, had lost its composure entirely. What was underneath was not guilt, exactly. It was the expression of a man calculating and finding the calculation has come up short. "Sit down," Ronan said to him. Brevith sat. Ronan looked at Thesson. "The document is not entered. The session is suspended pending formal review of the evidence presented." He paused. "And I want council members Veith, Aldmore, and Brevith confined to their summit quarters until that review is complete." Thesson was already writing. She left the hall during the suspension, not because she was done. The review would take days, and there was still the third name, still the gap she had been circling for months. But she needed air, and she needed to think, and she needed to be somewhere that wasn't watched for approximately 10 minutes. She found a side corridor that ran along the building's eastern wall, a service passage with narrow windows that let in gray afternoon light. She walked to the end of it and stood at the window and looked out at the grounds and breathed. Her hands were shaking slightly. She noticed it without judgment, the body accounting for what the mind had been too occupied to process. 8 months of careful, controlled movement, and now this, the first real break in the surface of it. She pressed her palms flat against the cold stone of the windowsill. 4 confirmed council members implicated. Documentary evidence on the table in front of every pack lord in the kingdom. Witnesses corroborated. The revision order signed and dated in Veith's hand. It was not everything she had needed. The third name, the person in her household, the source of the original forgeries, was still unconfirmed. But it was enough to make the case undeniable. Enough that Ronan had moved before she'd asked him to. That was what she hadn't planned for, how fast he'd moved. She had built her approach around a Ronan who would be slow, who would defer to process, to review, to the council voices around him that she expected to intercede. She had not accounted for the version of him that simply turned away from Veith mid-sentence and called for confinement. She filed that away. It was information. Footsteps in the corridor. She didn't turn. "I thought you'd have stayed in there," Corvin said, behind her, "given what just happened." "Reviews take time. I'm not useful in the room while Thesson documents." He came to stand beside her at the window. He looked tired in the particular way of someone who has been given information that requires them to rebuild a significant portion of what they thought they understood. "The king wants to speak with you," he said. "I know. Tonight, after the formal suspension is documented." He paused. "He asked me to arrange it privately." She looked out the window. The grounds were empty. The summit's attendants and guards had mostly moved inside when the session suspended. A crow was working at something near the edge of the tree line. "Where?" she said. "The private council chamber on the second floor. He'll be there by the evening bell." She nodded. Corvin was quiet for a moment. Then, "He recognized something in the hall. I could see it." Another pause. "I don't know what he recognized. I don't know who you are." He said it carefully, meaning he suspected, meaning he had decided not to ask directly. "You've been helpful," she said. "Whatever happens in the next few days, you should know that." He accepted that without pressing further and left the corridor. She stayed at the window until the crow finished what it was doing and flew. She did not go to the private council chamber at the evening bell. She went to Sable. Sable was in a room on the Summit building's 3rd floor, technically a storage room, practically a command post, where she had been coordinating the witness handling and document security since morning. She looked up when Serafina came in, read her face, and sent her 2 people out of the room without being asked. "He wants to meet tonight," Serafina said. "I know. Corvin told one of mine." Sable set down what she was writing. "What's your read?" "He moved faster than I expected. He cut Veith off before I had to push. That's either because he's genuinely responding to the evidence or because—" She stopped. Sable waited. "Because someone told him something before the session, something that primed him." "Does it change tonight?" She thought about it. "No, I'm going." She sat down on one of the storage room's heavy crates. "I need you to get me the 3rd name before I walk into that room. If I go in without it, I'm managing a conversation without the full picture. He'll ask questions I can't answer completely." The archivist has been working the transaction record since last night, Sable said. He thinks he can confirm by morning. I need it before the evening bell. Sable looked at her steadily. That's 3 hours. I know what it is. Sable stood up. I'll push him. She moved toward the door, then stopped. One thing. What? When you go in tonight, whatever he asks you, whatever he says to you, she looked at her directly, without softening it. Don't let him make it about the two of you before you've finished what needs to be finished. The third name is still out there. If you walk into that room as Serafina before you've closed the chain, I know. Do you? Serafina looked at her. Yes. Sable held the look for a moment longer. Then she left. The archivist sent word at the 5th hour. She was in her room, a proper summit guest room, arranged by Brenwick's credentialing, when the message came. A folded note passed through 2 hands, written in the cipher. She opened it. She read the name. She read it again. She sat with it for a very long time. The name was not Vietz. It was not Aldmore's. It was not Brevet's or any of the council members she had been mapping. It was not anyone in the formal power structure she had been investigating. It was a name she knew the way she knew her own hands. A name that had been inside her rooms, inside her household, inside the operational core of everything she had been and done for 3 years. Mira, her personal secretary. A woman she had appointed herself, independent of council vetting 2 years into her bonding. A woman who had been with her through the Iron Gate negotiations, through the settlement work, through every document and seal and correspondence. A woman whose competence she had trusted completely and whose loyalty she had never once thought to question because loyalty had simply seemed like the obvious description of what existed between them. The archivist had found her name on 3 documents, not as a forger, as a supplier. The person who had provided the original seal impressions, the original correspondence samples, the specific handwriting references that the professional forgers had used to build the fabrications, the person who had given them everything they needed to make the frame believable. Mira had built the evidence that killed her. Serafina sat in her room and did not move for a long time. The lamp burned. The building outside her door conducted its quiet summit night business. Somewhere below, in the formal council chamber, the San was still documenting. She had thought, in the months at Sable's settlement, that she had processed the full scope of what had been done to her. She had thought she had reached the floor of it. She understood now, sitting with this piece of paper in a summit guest room, that she had been processing what strangers had done to her. This was a different level entirely. This was the specific surgical wound that only proximity can make. The kind that requires years of access, years of trust, years of you believing in someone while they are methodically building your destruction. She set the paper down on the bed beside her and looked at her hands. They were not shaking. She noticed that. She wasn't sure if it meant she was strong or simply that she had gone somewhere past the reach of the body's ordinary response. Mira had known everything, had been there through every stage, had watched her investigate the Iron Gate figures and then gone directly to the people who needed to know she was getting close. Mira had been the one who flagged her. Mira had been the reason they moved when they moved. She stood up. She put the note in the lamp flame and watched it go. She adjusted her coat. She checked the documents she was carrying, a second sealed copy of the evidence package that she would leave with Brenwick's steward as insurance, regardless of what happened tonight. She did this systematically. One thing, then the next. Then she walked to the private council chamber on the 2nd floor. Ronan was already there. He was standing at the window when she came in. The same posture she'd watched across the summit hall, hands not quite at ease. The room was small by summit standards. A table, 6 chairs, maps on the wall, a single lamp. No council members, no aides. The door closed behind her. He turned. They were perhaps 12 feet apart. In 6 months of planning, she had run through this moment many times, not the emotional version of it. She had specifically avoided rehearsing the emotional version because that was the version that could make her sloppy. She had rehearsed the functional version, what she needed to say, what she needed to establish before anything else. She had known, even while rehearsing the functional version, that the functional version was not what was going to happen first. He looked at her. The lamp made the shadows in his face deeper than the hall's light had. He looked at her the way she had watched him look at things he was trying to solve, with that particular concentration, that refusal to look away from something difficult. "Take off the coat," he said. She held very still. "You're standing like her," he said. "The coat's different, the hair's different, but the way you stand when you're waiting for someone to make a mistake." His voice was very controlled. "I know that." She looked at him. "Raven Ashford," she said. "Don't." His voice broke on the word. Just slightly. Just at the edge of it. He got it back immediately. "Don't do that. Not in this room. Not with me standing here." The lamp flame moved in a draft from the window gap. She watched it. "Serafina," he said. She had not heard her name spoken aloud in 8 months. Not her actual name. Raven, constantly. Raven from everyone. In every room. Every conversation. 8 months of wearing a name that wasn't hers, that fit better now than it had at first, but still didn't fit the way your own name fits. The way it lands in you when someone says it. The way it connects to something before thought. Her jaw tightened. She felt it. She let it. "Yes," she said. The word came out level. She made sure of that. She had 4 things she needed to establish in this room before anything else could happen, and she was not going to lose the thread of them, because her name, said aloud in his voice, had just done something to the inside of her chest that she hadn't adequately planned for. He crossed the room. Not fast. He moved the way he moved when he wasn't performing authority, careful and direct and very aware of the space between himself and whatever he was moving toward. He stopped 3 feet from her, close enough that she could see the full detail of his face, the lines that hadn't been there 3 years ago, the tension held in his jaw, the thing in his eyes that she was not going to name, because naming it would cost her something she couldn't afford to spend right now. "You're alive," he said. "Yes." 8 months. "Yes." He breathed. She watched his chest move with it. "I stood at that window," he said. "I watched them." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I watched the scaffold and Ronan." She kept her voice level. She had to. "There are things I need to tell you before you were alive." His voice had changed. Something in it had gone past controlled and was now in different territory. Not anger, not grief. Something that was both and neither. The specific kind of reckoning that happens when a person has been carrying a weight for long enough that putting it down doesn't feel like relief. "You were alive and I didn't know, and you've been working," she said. "I've been working, and there's still a piece of it you don't have." She held his gaze. "I need you to stay with me on this. There's a third name, someone in my household, someone I trusted directly." He stared at her. "Mira," she said. The name landed on his face the way she knew it would. Recognition, then confusion, then a specific kind of sick understanding. He knew Mira. Had known her as a fixed point of Serafina's household, the same way you know the furniture of a life you've shared. Present, unremarkable, assumed. "She provided the originals," Serafina said. "The archivist confirmed it tonight. She was the supply source for the forgeries. Every document they built the case on came from materials she gave them." Ronan said nothing. His face had gone to somewhere past expression. "She had access to everything," Serafina said. "She was inside the rooms, the files, the archive. She gave them the seal impressions, the handwriting samples, the specific correspondence they needed." She paused. "She's been here for the summit. She's currently in the building." "Where?" he said. "East Wing. She's credentialed as a council administrative aide. She changed her presentation to different name, different affiliation, but the archivist identified her through the transaction records." She reached into her coat and produced the sealed evidence package. "Everything is in here. The full chain. Veith, Aldmore, Brevith, and Mira. The financial trail, the documents, the witnesses." She held it out. "This is what you need to put it before a formal tribunal." He looked at the package. He looked at her. He took it. He held it in both hands and looked at it as if it had weight beyond its physical form. Which it did. She understood that. It held the complete accounting of what had been done in his kingdom while he was trusting the wrong people, what had been done to his mate, what he had been used to do. "I need to ask you something," he said. She waited. "When you were in that hall today, when you stood up." He looked at her. "You were going to do this without telling me who you were. You were going to present the evidence to the summit and let it do what it did, and you were going to remain Raven Ashford." It wasn't a question. He knew the answer. "Yes," she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. "Why?" "Because the evidence doesn't require me to be alive to be true," she said, "and because coming back as myself before the case was complete was a risk I wasn't willing to take." "A risk to the case?" "Yes, not a risk to yourself." She didn't answer that. Not because she didn't have an answer. Because the answer was complicated in ways she wasn't going to work through in this room tonight. He looked at her. The lamp moved again. His jaw was very tight. "I believe them," he said. "I want you to know that I know you believed them." She kept her voice even. "They built it specifically so you would. They used what they knew about us, about the last year, about what had changed between us. They built the frame around it. You believed evidence that was designed to be believed by you specifically." She paused. "That's not an absolution, but it's the truth of how it worked." He absorbed that. She watched it move through him. The specific discomfort of receiving information that partially alleviates guilt and is therefore almost worse than full blame, because it requires a more complicated reckoning. "What do you need from me?" he said. "For the tribunal, for the formal process." "Your full support for an independent review. Not council-led, independent with pack lord observers, and confinement orders for all 4 before morning, before anyone can move to destroy remaining evidence." "Done." He said it immediately. The word had no hesitation in it. She nodded. She should leave now. The functional version of this conversation was complete. She had what she needed. The evidence package was in his hands. The requests were confirmed. The case was as solid as 8 months of work could make it. She should leave. She stayed where she was. He was looking at her with something that she didn't know how to meet and didn't know how to look away from. 3 feet of distance between them, and 8 months, and everything that had been built and destroyed and built again in those months. She could feel the shape of what he wanted to say. She knew him well enough to feel it before he spoke it, the specific configuration of his face when words were forming that he wasn't sure he had the right to say. "Serafina." The door opened. They both turned. Corvin stood in the doorway. His face was wrong. She registered it immediately. The color, the breath, the look of someone who has been running and arrived carrying something bad. "What?" Ronan said. "Mira is gone," Corvin said. "East Wing room is empty. The window—" He stopped. She had a rope. She'd prepared. Someone warned her. He looked between them. Someone told her the archivist had confirmed her name. The room was very quiet. Serafina looked at the wall. She calculated in the seconds of silence. The east wing, the grounds, the distance to the nearest road, the horses in the summit stable. The time between when the archivist had sent the note and when she had come to this room. The number of hands the note had passed through. "How long ago?" she said. "The guard estimates the window at half an hour, maybe 40 minutes. Half an hour. She had been sitting in her room with the note for longer than that. She looked at Ronan. He was already looking at her. Without Mira, the chain had a gap. The documentary evidence was solid. The transaction records, the document analysis, the revision order. But Mira was the person who could confirm the internal operation, the person who had been inside the household and could testify to the specific mechanics of how the originals had been obtained. Without her testimony, the defense, and there would be a defense, Veith would have counsel, could argue the transaction records were circumstantial, could argue the archivist's analysis was interpretive, could create enough procedural doubt to delay a tribunal indefinitely. Mira's disappearance was not an accident. Someone in this building, tonight, had known the archivist's confirmation was coming and had moved Mira before the evidence could be formally entered. Someone who had access to the summit's internal communications. Someone who had been watching the evening's developments closely enough to know the exact moment to act. She turned the calculation over in her mind like a stone, looking at the underside. Someone who had been inside this building all day, inside the session, inside the suspension, who had been close enough to the proceedings to know what the archivist was working on. "The confinement orders," she said to Ronan. "The 4 names I gave you, are they in their rooms?" Ronan looked at Corvin. Corvin's face told her before he spoke. "We checked after the window report. Veith is in his room. Aldmore is in his room." He stopped. "Brevith's room is empty." Brevith, who had stood up in the session and presented the documents, who had moved toward the door when the witnesses were called, who had been confined by Ronan's order and had then had, by her count, 6 hours in a summit guest room with whatever resources and contacts he'd managed to bring into this building. Brevith had warned Mira. Brevith, who was supposed to be confined, had found a way to reach her, which meant Brevith had prepared for this contingency before the session even opened, had anticipated the possibility that the session would go wrong, had positioned Mira's exit as the backup. She had been 8 months ahead of them. They had been one contingency ahead of her. She looked at Ronan. He was watching her face with the concentrated attention of a man reading a map. "She's going to run," Serafina said, "and if she reaches whoever is receiving her, wherever Brevith's network sends her, we lose the testimony. We lose the internal chain." She paused. "Everything else holds. The documentary evidence is enough for a tribunal, but without her, a good defense counsel makes it a 2-year process." She looked at the window. "Maybe longer." "Tell me what you need," Ronan said. She stood in the lamplight and felt the shape of what was required settle over her. Not what she'd planned, not what she'd built toward. Something harder and more immediate. Something that required a different version of herself than the one she'd been constructing for 8 months. Raven Ashford had operated in patience, in the long approach, in the controlled revelation at the moment of perfect preparation. That version of herself had run out of time. What came next was going to require something raw, something that didn't operate through documentation and carefully arranged summit proceedings. She was going to have to move in the dark, on bad information, against a woman who had a 40-minute head start and the specific advantage of knowing exactly how Serafina Vale operated, because she had spent 2 years watching her operate from the inside. The woman who had been condemned at dawn and risen in the ashes of a different name had built herself very carefully, had controlled every variable she could reach, had believed somewhere beneath the calculation that 8 months of preparation would be enough to leave nothing to chance. Mira had just shown her what that belief was worth. She breathed. "Once. Let it go. I need 2 horses," she said, "and someone who knows the Eastern Road." Ronan's hand came up and his fingers closed around her wrist, not stopping her. Something else. Something that was not a gesture from the Alpha King and not a gesture from her mate, and was instead something entirely unscripted. Just his hand on her wrist, just the specific warmth and weight of it, just 2 people standing 3 feet apart with 8 months between them and everything ahead still unresolved. She looked at his hand, then at his face. "Come back," he said. It was not a command, it was not a plea. It landed somewhere between those 2 things, in the place where words stop being language and become something else. She looked at him for a moment that she would not later be able to measure. Then she removed her wrist from his hand gently, the way you set something down rather than drop it, and turned toward the door. The night was cold. The Eastern Road was dark. Mira had 40 minutes and Serafina had none, and the version of herself she was going to need for whatever came next was not the patient one, not the careful one, not the one who had built 8 months of controlled approach in a mountain settlement. It was the one who had stood at dawn in execution whites and found, at the absolute bottom of everything, that she was still there. That one was more than enough. The Eastern Road was frozen ground and no moon. She rode hard for the first mile, letting the horse find its footing in the dark before she pushed it further. The summit grounds fell behind her, lights still burning in the upper floors, the distant sound of the building's night activity. Ronan, somewhere inside it, issuing confinement orders and sending word to the tribunal clerks and doing all the things that needed doing in rooms she was no longer in. She had a torch. 1. She was conserving it. The man Ronan had sent with her was named Garrett, a border scout, compact and weathered, who had said exactly 4 words since they left the stable. East Road, then left. He rode slightly ahead of her and navigated the dark with the ease of someone who had done this specific thing many times in worse conditions. She watched how he moved and matched it. Her mind was running the calculation continuously. Mira had 40 minutes at departure. 25 now, accounting for the time spent in the council chamber and the stable. The eastern road connected to 2 branch points within the first 3 miles. North toward the mountain passes, south toward the border settlements. North meant the Dusk Moor territories, which was the obvious route for someone with connections to the conspiracy's external partners. South meant a longer road but better cover, more population, more places to disappear into. She thought about Mira. Not with anger. She had moved past the first version of that reaction in the summit guest room. What she was doing now was colder and more useful. She was thinking about Mira the way she had learned to think about everyone in these months, as a person with specific capabilities and specific limitations, a pattern of behavior that could be read if you knew how to read it. Mira was not a field operative. She had been a secretary, an administrator, a person whose value was access and documentation. She would be frightened on the eastern road in the dark. She would be moving fast and not necessarily smart. She would be going north because north was what she'd been told to go, because she would be following instructions from Breveth's network rather than operating on her own judgment. People following instructions went north. North Branch, she said to Garrett. He adjusted without question. They found the horse at the 2-mile mark. Not Mira, the horse. Standing at the side of the road with its reins caught in the brush at the tree line, blowing hard, one foreleg held slightly off the ground. A travel horse, not a summit stable horse. Brought in from outside, positioned for exactly this, and now lame from pushing it too fast on frozen ground. Garrett swung down and went to the animal with the efficient calm of someone assessing a tool. She's on foot, he said. This happened recent. The sweat's still warm. On foot in the dark on a mountain road in autumn. That changed the calculation considerably. She dismounted. The torch, she lit it now. There was no longer any use in conserving it. The flame pushed back the immediate dark and made the tree line visible. She scanned the road surface. Frozen mud held impressions poorly, but held them. She could see where the horse had veered, where it had gone down briefly, where Mira had left the road on the right side heading for the tree line. Into the trees. On foot. Which meant she wasn't running anymore. She was hiding. That was worse in some ways. A person running could be overtaken. A person hiding in a forest at night who knew you were coming, who had the specific advantage of stillness over movement, that was a different problem. Stay with the horses, she said to Garrett. If I'm not back in an hour, go back and tell them the North Branch. 2 miles out, forest on the right. I'm supposed to stay with you, Garrett said. I know. She held his gaze. Stay with the horses. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalibrating his assignment against the specific quality of the instruction. Then he stepped back. She took the torch and went into the trees. The forest was old growth. Silver birch and mountain pine, the undergrowth minimal because the canopy was dense enough to suppress it. The torch made a circle of orange light and made everything outside it invisible. She was aware of this. She was aware that she was visible and Mira was not, and that this was a significant tactical disadvantage, and she went forward anyway because the alternative was standing at the tree line until dawn and watching the case fall apart in the interim. She moved carefully, not fast. Fast in a dark forest with a torch was how you fell, or how you missed what you were supposed to see. She had gone perhaps 100 feet when she stopped. Sound. Breathing. Not hers. The specific quality of someone trying to suppress it. The slightly wrong rhythm. The controlled inhale that was too controlled. She turned the torch in a slow arc. Mira was 20 feet to her left, pressed against the broad trunk of a pine, standing very still in the coat she'd worn to the summit. She looked, not as Serafina had expected, not panicked, not the way a person looked when they'd been running in the dark and gone lame and been found. She looked tired and resolved, in the way that people look when they have decided something and are past the decision. They looked at each other across 20 feet of dark forest and torchlight. Mira, Serafina said. The word came out plain. Not an accusation. Not yet. Just her name, the same way Ronan had said hers. The word as recognition, as the prior thing to everything else. Mira's jaw worked. You should be dead, she said. I know. They told me you were dead. Her voice was flat. Not defensive, not guilty. Just flat, in the particular way of someone who has been operating inside a belief for 8 months and is now confronting its inversion. They told me the execution was confirmed. It was staged. She took one step closer. Who told you I was dead, specifically? Mira's eyes moved, not evasion, calculation. Brevith's man, the week after. She paused. He told me the operation was complete, that it was done. And before that, when you provided the originals, she kept her voice even. When you gave them the seal impressions and the correspondence samples, what did they tell you then? Something moved through Mira's face. The flatness cracked slightly. Not into guilt, into something more complicated. They told me what you'd done, she said. The Duskmore correspondence, the intelligence transfers, they showed you forgeries, Serafina said, built from the originals you had already given them. Silence. The forest was very still. The torch flame was the only movement. You believed them, Serafina said. Mira looked at her. Her eyes, in the torchlight, were doing something that Serafina didn't want to see and couldn't look away from. You were investigating the Iron Gate figures, she said. You were asking questions that were, I thought you had found something. I thought it meant you were involved. I thought the Duskmore letters were real because you were already looking at the finances and it made... She stopped. It made sense, Serafina said quietly. Of a kind. Yes. They designed it to make sense, to the people closest to me. Specifically. She took another step. They knew the evidence wouldn't survive scrutiny from strangers. It had to be believed by the people who knew me well enough to fill in the gaps themselves. Mira was very still. They used your love for this kingdom, Serafina said, your sense of what was right. They showed you something that looked like betrayal and asked you to act on it, and you did, because you believed you were protecting something. Don't, Mira said. Her voice had gone rough. Don't explain it to me like I was a... Don't make it manageable. I'm not making it manageable. I'm telling you what happened. I gave them everything they needed to kill you. The words came out stripped, no softening on them. Whatever they told me, whatever I believed, I gave them what they needed, and you were supposed to die. The torch burned. The forest held still around them. Serafina stood in the middle of it and felt the weight of what this woman had done and what this woman was carrying, and the two things coexisted in her without resolving into something simpler. She had expected to be angrier here. She had thought, in the summit room, that finding Mira would be the end of a line she had been following for months, and that the end of the line would feel like something definitive. It felt like standing in a dark forest with a torch, looking at a person who had made a catastrophic mistake because she had been expertly manipulated into it, which was a different thing entirely from the clean architecture of deliberate betrayal. It didn't change what needed to happen. Come back with me, she said. Testify. Tell them exactly what they told you, what you gave them, the full sequence. It closes the chain. The tribunal can proceed. And then what? And then whatever a tribunal decides. That's not... Mira stopped, started again. That's not an answer I can... It's the only answer I have. She held Mira's gaze. I'm not going to tell you it goes easily. I'm not going to tell you the tribunal is lenient or that it doesn't matter what you gave them. It matters. But your testimony closes something that needs to be closed, and that's what I need from you. Mira looked at her for a long time, the kind of look that went to some internal accounting, some balance being struck between what was owed and what was survivable. Then footsteps hit the frozen ground behind Serafina, hard and fast, and she spun. 3 men came through the trees from the north, not from the road, from deeper in the forest, which meant they had been positioned there, waiting. Brevith's people, placed in advance of Mira's route, which meant Breveth had anticipated pursuit and had set this up not as an escape route but as a trap. The first man reached her before she could fully turn. He was large and moved without hesitation, which told her he had done this kind of thing before. She got her left arm up and took the impact on the forearm rather than the face and used the momentum to push sideways rather than back, which kept her on her feet but cost her the torch. It hit the ground and rolled, and the light shifted wildly. She knew, in the 2 seconds that followed, that she was not going to win a physical engagement against 3 trained men in a dark forest. She knew this the way she had learned to know tactical realities in 8 months of operating outside the structures that had previously kept her safe, not with panic, with clarity. She could not win this fight. Therefore, she was not going to fight it. She ran, not away from the men, toward Mira. She covered the 20 feet in 4 strides and grabbed Mira's arm and moved, pulling her south through the trees, back toward the road and the horses. Behind her, she heard the men reorienting, a beat of confusion, which was all she had bought herself, and then pursuit. Mira ran. She gave her that. Whatever Mira was and whatever she had done, when someone grabbed her arm in a dark forest and ran, she ran with them. The trees were dark. The torch was gone. She was navigating by the memory of the ground she'd crossed coming in, and by the faint ambient light difference between the forest interior and the road's edge. She hit the tree line wrong. A branch across the face, she felt it open a cut above her right eye. And then they were through it, onto the road. Garrett was still there. She had not been fully certain he would be. He took one look at the 2 of them and the men breaking from the tree line behind them and had both horses moving before she reached him. She shoved Mira up onto the first horse with more force than finesse, heard Mira grab the reins, swung onto the second horse herself. Garrett had already turned his animal south and was riding. She didn't look back. She kicked her horse forward and rode. The men had no horses. She knew that within the first minute, no pursuit sounds that matched mounted speed. Breveth had positioned them for an ambush at a fixed point, not a chase. He had expected Serafina to come in on the road, find Mira's downed horse, and follow her into the trees, where the 3 men would handle it. He had not, apparently, accounted for Mira running with her. She rode for 2 miles before she slowed enough to take stock. The cut above her eye was bleeding into her vision on the right side. She wiped it against her coat sleeve without stopping. Mira was ahead of her, riding hard, not looking back. Garrett was pacing alongside. She let out a breath that had been compressed for the last several minutes and felt, in the release of it, the toll of the night's accumulated physical reality. The cold had been in her bones since they left the summit grounds. Her forearm where she'd taken the impact was already stiffening. The eye was not serious, but it was bleeding with the insistence that facial cuts had. She rode anyway. The summit lights came back into view around the 3rd mile. They came through the summit's north gate at the 2nd hour past evening bell. Ronan was in the outer yard. She didn't know if he had been waiting there since she left, or had come down when the gate guard sent word of approaching horses. He was there when she came through, and he looked at Mira and then at Serafina's face, and his expression did something complicated and fast that he brought back under control immediately. She dismounted. Her legs were steady. She noted that. "She'll testify," she said to Ronan. "Full sequence. Everything they told her. Everything she gave them." She glanced at Mira, who had dismounted and was standing with her arms crossed against the cold, looking at the ground. "Tonight, before anything else moves." Ronan nodded. He said something to Garrett, who took the horses. He said something to the 2 guards near the gate, who moved toward Mira. Not roughly, but with the clear intention of escort rather than option. Mira went without objection. Then it was just them in the outer yard. He stepped forward and reached for her face, the cut, his thumb coming up toward it, and she caught his wrist. Not rejection, just not yet. "Breveth had men positioned in the forest," she said. "North branch, approximately 2 miles out. He anticipated pursuit. He set it up as an ambush." She held his gaze. "He planned for me specifically, which means someone told him I had identified Mira, someone between the archivist's note and this courtyard." Ronan went very still. "The note passed through 3 hands," she said, "before it reached me. The archivist. A courier. And whoever the courier handed it to before me." She paused. "I need those 3 names." He looked at her. The yard was cold and quiet. Inside the summit building, lights were moving behind windows. The building was awake, processing the night's events, the suspended session, and the confinement orders and whatever rumors had been moving through the delegation quarters since evening bell. "You think there's a fifth," he said. "I think Breveth didn't position 3 men in a forest based on intuition." She looked at him directly. "I think someone in this building tonight told him the archivist had confirmed Mira's name and that I was going after her. I think that person is still inside." She paused. "And I think you have them somewhere in your council, your staff, or your immediate household." The word household landed in the space between them with its specific weight. She watched him receive it. The expansion of the conspiracy's reach, the implication that the thing he had just begun to understand the shape of had not yet shown him its full dimensions. It moved through his face with the quality of something genuinely difficult. Not the difficulty of information, the difficulty of what the information meant for every fixed point he had trusted. She knew that difficulty. She had been living in it for 8 months. "I know what this is," she said quietly, "the feeling of the ground moving under you, not knowing which surfaces hold." She held his gaze. "You have to let it move. You have to hold the uncertainty and keep working because the alternative is standing still, and that's what they need you to do." He looked at her for a moment, then, "You learned that?" "Yes." "It cost you?" "Yes." She let that be what it was without adding to it. "The 3 names, the courier's chain. I need it before the tribunal opens." He straightened. The thing that had been visible in his face, the raw, unguarded version of it that the cold and the hour and everything else had temporarily stripped his control from, settled back into something more composed, not less real, just held differently. "I'll have it in an hour," he said. "Corvin's been—" The main door of the summit building opened, hard, the way doors opened when whoever was behind them had stopped calculating the impression they made. Corvin came through it at a near run, which Serafina had not seen him do before, and the look on his face was the same wrong quality it had been when he'd told them about Mira's window. "The tribunal room," he said to Ronan. "You need to come now." "What happened?" "Veeth." Corvin stopped. He was breathing hard. "He's not in his room. He was confirmed an hour ago, and now he's gone, and the guard at his door—" He stopped again. "The guard is unconscious. He's been unconscious for at least 40 minutes. Someone sedated him." The outer yard was very quiet. Serafina looked at Ronan. He was looking at Corvin. The muscle in his jaw had locked. Veeth was gone. Breveth had been managing the external element, the forest ambush, Mira's route. Veeth had been managing something else, something inside the building, and he had spent his confinement not waiting, but executing a second layer that she hadn't seen. "The evidence package," she said. Her voice came out very flat. "The sealed copy I gave you tonight." Ronan looked at her. "Where is it?" she said. He turned to Corvin. Corvin's face told her before any of them moved. She was already heading for the door. The tribunal room was on the building's ground floor, north wing, chosen by Thesson for its lockable cabinets and its position near the session clerk's station. She covered the distance at a run that she didn't consciously decide on, Ronan behind her, Corvin behind him, her boots on the stone floor of the corridor making more noise than she wanted to make and not slowing down anyway. The tribunal room door was open. She came through it and stopped. Hassan was inside. He was alive, seated, unhurt, but with the stunned look of someone who had been in the room when something happened and was still integrating it. On the table where the document packages had been laid out for the tribunal's morning review, there was a gap. Not empty. There were documents remaining, but the gap was exactly the size and position of the sealed evidence package she had handed Ronan in the council chamber. And the Iron Gate originals. The physical originals that Petra had carried in from the settlement, the foundation of the financial chain. Both gone. She stood at the table and looked at the gap, and let the full shape of it land in her. Veeth had not run. Running was Breveth's play, Mira's play. Veeth had stayed and used his confinement hour to do something surgical, remove the 2 pieces of evidence that could not be reconstructed from memory or testimony alone. The physical originals that proved the revision was a deliberate falsification, the sealed package that contained the complete chain. Without those two elements, the tribunal had witness testimony and the archivist's analysis and the revision order bearing Veith's signature, all of it valuable. None of it alone, enough to prevent a defense from building a procedural case for reasonable doubt. Veith knew exactly what he had taken. He had taken the minimum necessary to make the tribunal survivable. She put both hands flat on the table, on the wood beside the gap, and breathed. Behind her, Ronan came through the door and stopped. She heard him take in the room. She felt the weight of what was required settle over her again, harder this time, with the specific heaviness of something that has just become more difficult than it already was. She had Mira's testimony. She had the archivist's analysis. She had the revision order. She had 4 confirmed allies among the Pack Lords and 3 witnesses whose accounts were already in Thesson's ledger. She did not have the originals. The originals were somewhere in this building, in Veith's possession, being moved toward whatever exit he had prepared. If he got them out of the summit grounds, they would disappear into the same infrastructure that had produced them, and they would either be destroyed or surfaced later as counter-evidence at whatever tribunal Veith's defense team arranged. She had been here before. Not this specifically, but this quality of moment. The thing that looked like the floor of the problem revealing itself as a platform above something deeper. She had survived the scaffold. She had survived 8 months in a mountain settlement building something from nothing. She had come back into the kingdom that had declared her dead, and she had sat in rooms with the people responsible for it. And she had been patient and precise, and she had built a case that was, right now, more solid than anything she had walked into the summit with. Veith had just taken 2 pieces of it. She still had the rest. She lifted her hands from the table and stood straight and turned to face Ronan, who was looking at her with the eyes of a man who is watching someone decide something and has the specific intelligence not to interrupt the deciding. "He's still in the building," she said. "He had 40 minutes. The night guards were briefed on the confinement orders. He can't have used the main exits without creating a record that would reach us. He's waiting for a window." She looked at Ronan. "He has the documents and he needs a way out, which means he needs a contact inside the building to open that window for him." "The 5th, Ronan said. "Yes." She held his gaze. The cut above her eye had stopped bleeding. The forearm was stiff. The night had been long and was not finished. "The 5th is going to move in the next 30 minutes to get Veith out, which means we have 30 minutes to find them both before the evidence walks out of this building permanently." Ronan looked at her. Then he turned to Corvin. "Lock every exit," he said. "Every door, every window with a drop less than 2 stories. I want pack warriors at each one, not summit guards. Our people. No exceptions." He moved toward the door. "And I want the full building roster. Every person credentialed for this summit, cross-referenced against the courier chain from tonight." He stopped in the doorway and looked back at her. "You said the courier passed through 3 hands." "Yes." "Give me the names you know. I'll find the 3rd. She gave them to him. He went. She stood in the tribunal room with Thesson's stunned silence and the gap on the table and the 30 minutes that were already running down. Somewhere in this building, Veith was moving. He was careful, and he was experienced, and he had spent 8 months watching her case build toward him, and he had made one move that had taken 2 critical pieces off the table. He was good at this. She had always known he was good at this. You did not build and execute a frame of this complexity without being genuinely skilled. But he had spent 8 months watching Raven Ashford. He had not spent 8 months watching Seraphina Vale. She picked up the lamp from the table and walked out of the tribunal room and went hunting. She found him in the archive room, not by strategy, by the specific logic of a man who had spent 30 years working with documents and who, under pressure, returned to what he understood. The Summit Building's archive room was on the ground floor, east wing, adjacent to the session clerk's station, a room full of locked cabinets and the smell of old paper and ink, the kind of room that a certain type of person found instinctively orienting. She came through the door with the lamp, and Veith was at the far cabinet, the sealed evidence package under his left arm, and the Iron Gate originals in his right hand, and a man she didn't recognize standing between them with a short blade already drawn. The 5th. She clocked him in the half-second before he moved, mid-40s, summit administrative dress, the particular posture of someone trained rather than naturally violent. He moved toward her with the blade low, and she set the lamp on the nearest cabinet and stepped left into the narrow corridor between the shelving units and let him commit to the angle he'd chosen before she changed her direction. He was faster than she'd estimated. The blade caught her left side. Not deep, she was already turning away from it, but she felt the specific bright line of it through her coat and the layer beneath it. She got her elbow across his wrist on the follow-through and used the leverage to drive him into the shelving. The impact knocked 2 cabinet doors open and sent him sideways. She had maybe 3 seconds before he recovered. She turned to Veith. He had not moved toward the door. She registered that with a part of her mind that was running faster than her body. He hadn't run because he had calculated that the man with the blade would handle this, and he was waiting for that calculation to resolve. Now it hadn't resolved, and he was looking at her across 15 feet of archive room with the expression of a man whose plan has just hit its last load-bearing wall. "Put them on the table," she said. "You've been very thorough," he said. His voice was level. Even now, in this room, with his man on the floor getting up behind her and the building locked down outside the door, level. 8 months. The settlement. The identity. The evidence chain. It's genuinely impressive. "The table, Veith. The problem," he said, "is that impressive isn't the same as sufficient. The originals go with me, and the tribunal becomes a 2-year exercise that Aldmore's counsel will turn into a question of interpretation. You know that. I know that's what you're counting on. It's not counting, it's law. And you know enough about how this kingdom works to know I'm right." She did know that. She had known it the moment she'd seen the gap on the tribunal table, which was why she had come here instead of going to Ronan, instead of going to Garrett, instead of doing the thing that the logical chain of events suggested, because the logical chain of events gave Veith the time to reach whatever exit the fifth had opened for him. Behind her, the man with the blade was back on his feet. She heard him. She didn't turn. "Here's what I know," she said to Veith. "I know you built something that should have been permanent. You understood what you needed. You found the right people to execute it. You used every structural advantage you had. The forged documents were excellent. The witness preparation was thorough. Even Mira, the way you approached her, what you told her, the evidence you showed her, that was careful work." She paused. "You built it around a gap in Ronan's attention, and you filled that gap with something that looked exactly like his worst fear. That's not politics, that's surgery." Veith was very still. "And you did it," she said, "because you understood that the kingdom you wanted to run couldn't accommodate a Luna who read financial documents carefully, couldn't accommodate someone who would find the Iron Gate discrepancy eventually and follow it wherever it went." She held his gaze. "I wasn't a threat to you. I was an inconvenience that was going to become a threat. So you moved first." "This is a very generous accounting," he said. "It's an accurate one. I'm not generous with you." She took one step forward. "But I'm accurate. Because accuracy is what closes this, and I need you to understand that it's closed. The originals are copies." The room went very quiet. Veith looked at the documents in his hand, then at her. "Petra kept 2 sets, Serafina said. "Professional habit. She told me that when I found her. She said it almost apologetically, like it was a small thing. She kept a second set in a separate location as a matter of course, going back 15 years of her career. It's what archivists do when they've been doing the work long enough to know that documents disappear." She let that sit for a moment. "The originals are already at 3 separate locations outside this building. What you have is a very good copy, produced by the same archivist who identified your transaction records, authenticated to be indistinguishable from the original for the purpose of ensuring that you would take it." Veith's jaw worked once. The specific jaw movement of a man processing the revision of something he had been certain of. "The tribunal has everything," she said. "Taking those documents out of this room tonight changes nothing." Behind her, the man with the blade had gone still. She could feel the recalibration in him, the specific quality of a person whose tactical situation has just changed and who is running the new math. Veith set the documents on the nearest table, not the gesture of a man conceding, the gesture of a man setting down something that has ceased to be useful. He looked at her with the expression of someone arriving, finally, at the bottom of a calculation. "You could have let the summit session do it," he said. The evidence on the table was enough to start the process. You didn't need tonight. You didn't need the forest or the archive room. No? Then why? She looked at him. Because I needed to know there wasn't a version of this where you got to walk out with something. The door opened behind her. Ronan came through it with 2 pack warriors, and they moved past her to either side of the room with the efficiency of people who had been told what they were walking into. The man with the blade went down without resistance. Veith stood where he was and let them come to him, and did not, to his particular credit, perform any version of dignity or outrage. He simply stood and let it happen. She respected that, fractionally and without warmth. Ronan looked at the documents on the table, then at the blood on her coat, left side. His face did something compressed and fast. It's shallow, she said. I'll decide that. I've had worse. That is not the reassurance you think it is. He looked at her directly. Are you done in this room? She looked at Veith, being guided toward the door between the 2 warriors. She looked at the documents on the table. She looked at the lamp on the cabinet, still burning, the flame steady now that no one was moving through the room's air. Yes, she said. The tribunal opened at dawn. Mira testified for 2 hours. She spoke in the flat, precise way of someone who has decided that the only thing left with any integrity is complete accuracy, and she was accurate. The sequence, the approach, what they had told her, what she had believed, what she had provided, when, and to whom. She named the intermediary. She named the timeline. She named the specific documents she had removed from Serafina's archive and the method by which she had done it. The room was very quiet throughout. When she finished, Thassan asked if she had anything to add. She said, I want it on record that I believed what they told me. That is not mitigation. It is the truth, and the tribunal should have it. Thassan wrote it down. The archivist presented his analysis. The border assessor confirmed the figures. Petra's original documents, both sets, the one she had brought, and the authenticated copy that had served its purpose in the archive room, were entered into the formal record. The revision order bearing Veith's signature and its damning date were entered. The transaction records tracing the financial trail through the private intermediary to Veith, Aldmore, and Brevith were entered. Veith's counsel requested a recess for preparation. Thassan denied it. The tribunal deliberated for 4 hours. The pack lords who had been assembled as observers, including 3 of Serafina's confirmed allies and 4 others who had watched the night's proceedings with the particular attention of people recalibrating their understanding of the kingdom they operated in, deliberated with the seriousness of people who understood that what they decided in this room would set the terms for everything that came after. They returned unanimous findings on all counts against Veith, Aldmore, and Brevith. The 5th, the summit administrator, whose name was Darren, whose connection to Brevith went back 11 years through a trade contract arrangement, was remanded pending further review. Mira's case was separated for individual tribunal proceedings, accounting for the specific nature of her involvement. When Thassan read the findings, the room was silent in the way that large formal spaces go silent when something final has been said. Serafina sat in the witness gallery and listened to each finding and felt, with each one, something she had been carrying for 8 months shift incrementally. Not release. Nothing as clean as release. More like a structure that had been under load for a very long time beginning, carefully, to distribute that load differently. She had not slept. The wound on her left side had been cleaned and bound by the summit medic 2 hours before the tribunal opened, and it was not serious, and it pulled when she breathed too deeply, and she breathed carefully. The cut above her eye had been closed with 2 small strips of adhesive. She was wearing a different coat, borrowed from one of Brenwick's people, slightly too large in the shoulders. She looked like what she was, a person at the end of a very long night who had been in a forest and an archive room and was now sitting in a tribunal gallery watching 8 months of work produce its intended result. She had thought sometimes in the mountain settlement about what this moment would feel like. She had not been sentimental about it. She was not by nature or by acquired habit someone who spent significant time anticipating her own emotional states. But she had thought about it. The conclusion of the chain, the findings read aloud, the formal end of the thing that had been declared finished at dawn 8 months ago. It felt like work completed. That was the truest description. The kind of feeling that has no performance in it, no triumph, no particular warmth, just the specific quality of having done a thing that needed doing and having done it fully. That was enough. It was, she thought, exactly enough. 3 days after the tribunal findings, she sat with Ronan in the small courtyard at the Summit Building's center. A stone garden, dormant in the autumn cold, the kind of space that existed in formal buildings as an afterthought, and ended up being the most honest room in the structure because no one had designed an impression for it. He had asked for the meeting. She had come. They sat on opposite sides of a stone bench, which was cold and not designed for extended conversation, and that was appropriate. She had made a decision, somewhere in the 48 hours between the tribunal findings and this morning, about how she was going to be in this conversation. Not armor, not performance. She had worn both of those for 8 months, and they had served their purpose and she was done with them, specifically in this context. She was going to be present. That was all. She was going to sit in this courtyard with this man who had condemned her and whom she had loved for 3 years, and she was going to be present and honest and see what that produced. I've been trying to find the right words for 3 days, he said. There aren't right words for this. I know that. I've been trying anyway. He looked at his hands. What they built. What Veith built around what I was already feeling in that last year. The distance between us. I was pulling back and I knew I was doing it, and I told myself it was the weight of the campaign and the council demands, and he stopped. I gave them the architecture. They just filled it in. She was quiet for a moment. The courtyard was cold and still. A dry leaf moved across the stone near her feet. I've thought about that, she said. What I could have done differently. Whether if I had asked you directly, not worked around the distance, not given you room to manage it at your own pace, but just asked you directly what was happening between us, whether that would have changed the timeline. You shouldn't have had to. I know I shouldn't have. I'm not assigning myself fault in this. I'm saying I've looked at it from every angle because that's what I do, and because I needed to understand it fully before I could set it down. She looked at him. They used real material. The distance was real. The questions you had about us were real. They didn't invent that. They found it, and they shaped it, and they gave it a narrative that fit the doubts you already had. She paused. That's what makes it sophisticated. That's what makes it hard to defend against. I condemned you, he said. I sat in that room with their evidence, and I believed it because it confirmed something I was already afraid was true. Yes, he held her gaze. I want to tell you that I'm sorry, and have it mean something proportional to what happened. And I know there is no version of sorry that's proportional to what happened. She looked at him for a long moment. At his face, the lines that hadn't been there 3 years ago. The thing that had been living in his eyes since the tribunal. The specific weight of a man who has been forced to see himself clearly and found the view difficult. I know you're sorry, Tet, she said. I believe that. And I want to be honest with you about what that means to me, which is, it's true and it matters and it doesn't fix anything, and I'm not asking it to fix anything. Those are 3 separate facts that all exist at the same time. She shifted on the cold stone. I'm not going to tell you I've forgiven you because I think that framing is wrong for what this is. Forgiveness implies I'm returning something to a prior state. There is no prior state. There's just what's here. He was very still. What is here, he said carefully, is something I need to ask you about. She waited. The throne, he said. Your position. What was taken from you structurally, formally, as Luna. I want to restore... No. He stopped. Not in that form, she said. Not as restoration. Not as returning to what existed before, because what existed before had the structural conditions that made this possible. The council's unchecked authority over the vetting of household appointments. The financial oversight gaps that let the Iron Gate funds move without audit. The absence of any independent review mechanism for evidence presented in formal charges. She looked at him directly. I'm not coming back as Luna to a kingdom with those structures intact. I'm not coming back to a position that derives its legitimacy from its proximity to yours. He absorbed that. She watched the careful work of it in his face. Not resistance, exactly. Something more like the discomfort of receiving a truth that you needed and didn't ask for. What do you want? He said. A council charter. Independent. With pack lord representation and the authority to audit financial instruments, including the Crown's. Review rights over all formal charge evidence before any sentence can be carried out. Household appointment authority for the Luna's office that sits outside council vetting. She had thought about this, not in this conversation, across 8 months of watching what had failed and understanding specifically how it had failed. Those are the structural changes. They matter more than any title. And personally, he said, what do you want personally? The courtyard was quiet. Somewhere in the building above them, the summit's remaining work was being conducted. Pack lords finalizing trade arrangements, the session clerk documenting the tribunal findings for distribution, the ordinary machinery of governance continuing. She thought about the scaffold, about the tunnel and the mountain settlement and Sable's careful people and the months of becoming Raven Ashford and what it had cost and what it had built. She thought about the woman who had walked onto that scaffold and looked at a silhouette behind glass and chosen, in that moment, not to say the things that might have broken her open, but instead to hold steady, to look, to remember. That woman had not come back from the dead. She had simply kept going, through every version of the dark that the months had asked her to go through. And what she had found, on the other side of all of it, was not the person she had been. Something different. Harder in some places and oddly softer in others. In the specific places where she had stopped performing and started simply inhabiting. She was not going to lose that. Whatever came next, she was not going to trade that for anything that looked like returning to a prior version of herself. Time, she said. I want time to be this, and not have it be a problem. To not be required to become what I was before I had any reason to become something else. She held his gaze. I'm not the same person you bonded with, and you're not the same person either. If there's something here that's going to be rebuilt, it starts from what's actually here, not from what we remember. He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of looking that wasn't searching for anything specific, but was simply present, taking in what was in front of him without trying to shape it into something more manageable. That's fair, he said finally. I know it is. Something at the edge of his mouth moved. Not quite what she would have called a smile, so something prior to that, the shadow of one. She hadn't seen that specific expression on his face in a very long time, and she let herself see it without immediately filing it away. The council charter, he said. Yes. I'll have Corvin draft the framework. You should review it directly. He paused. Every article. I intend to. He nodded. He looked at the dormant garden around them, the bare branches, the cold stone, the gray sky holding steady above the courtyard walls. She's going to survive this, he said. The kingdom. Whatever the charter changes, whatever the tribunal produces, she has the capacity. She thought about the mid-kingdom settlements, the traders she had sat with in common rooms for 6 months, the anger that had no target yet, the communities that had absorbed the cost of decisions made by people who would never eat their bread or walk their roads, the capacity of ordinary people to keep going through things that should by rights have stopped them. Yes, she said. She does. They sat in the cold courtyard for a while longer, not talking, which was its own kind of honesty. The specific honesty of two people who have been through something that doesn't have a clean end and have found, between them, the willingness to sit with that without forcing it into resolution. The charter was drafted over 6 days. She reviewed every article, amended 4, rejected 1 entirely, and wrote it from the base, and signed the final version on the summit's last morning in the same room where Thesson had read the tribunal findings. Brennick witnessed it. 3 pack lords witnessed it. Corvin entered it into the formal record with the look of a man who was beginning to understand the specific weight of the work he had been given. Mira's tribunal produced a finding of culpable but manipulated involvement, with a sentence of supervised exile to the Northern Territories. It was not lenient. It was not, she thought, wrong. Somewhere in the country between those two things was where most real accountability ended up. In the uncomfortable middle, where the intentions and the acts and the consequences all had to be weighed simultaneously, and none of them canceled the others out. She saw Mira once before the exile order was carried out. Briefly. In the corridor outside the tribunal room, which was not planned, Mira was being escorted out and Serafina was coming in, and there was simply a moment of corridor and recognition and no one moving for about 3 seconds. Mira looked at her. The tiredness was still there, the resolution was still there. Something else too. Something that had no clean name, in the same way that most of the things that had happened in the past 8 months had no clean name. "I'm going to spend a long time thinking about what I didn't ask," Mira said. "I know. The questions I should have asked before I believed them." "Yes," Mira held her gaze for a moment. "I hope the charter holds." "It'll hold as long as the people in the room keep holding it," Serafina said. "That's how things like that work." Mira nodded once. Then the escort moved and she went, and Serafina watched her go and let what she felt about that be complicated and unresolved because it was, and there was no version of this that was going to make it otherwise. She turned and went into the tribunal room and got to work. She left the summit on the 7th morning. Not back to the capital immediately. There was work to do in the Mid-Kingdom settlements first. The communities that had absorbed the cost of the Iron Gate manipulations needed to know what had been found and what had been changed and what the charter meant for them specifically. That was not a letter that could be sent through the official post. That was a conversation that required a person in a room. She rode out at dawn, which she had not planned for and noticed only when she was already a mile from the summit grounds and the light behind her was doing that specific gray to gold shift. She rode through it. The road ahead was cold and open, and the trees along the eastern edge were the bare silver birch she had run through 4 nights ago in the dark. They looked different in morning light. They always did. The things you had moved through in the dark, seen clearly afterward. Not smaller, not less real. Just themselves, without the fear that the dark had added to them. She thought about what Sable had said to her months ago in the mountain settlement when she had asked what happens now, months, possibly longer. She had not known then how accurate that was going to be. She had not known the shape of what possibly longer meant, the specific texture of it, the daily work of becoming something new while carrying everything that made you what you were. She knew it now. The woman who had been declared dead at dawn had not come back. That was the truth of it, the version she was going to carry forward. Serafina Vale had stood on a scaffold and looked at the man she loved through glass and held herself together and then gone through a tunnel and a fever and 8 months of careful, difficult becoming. She had not come back from that. She had come through it. What came through was not a ghost of the prior version, not a harder shell over the same interior. Something genuinely different. A person who had learned in the most unforgiving possible classroom that survival was not the thing you found at the bottom of everything. Survival was the beginning. What you built after survival was the actual measure. She had built a council charter. She had built a case from nothing. She had built a name that fit her for 8 months, and then set it down when it had served its purpose, which was, she thought, exactly the right relationship to have with the things you become in order to endure. The road curved south. The settlement she was heading for was 2 hours out. Somewhere behind her, in the summit building she had left, Ronan was waking up to the work of implementing what the tribunal had found and the charter had formalized, which was not going to be simple and was not going to be short and was going to require every version of him. The one she had loved, the one she had condemned, the one she had watched choose correctly in the summit hall when it mattered. She thought about his hand on her wrist in the council chamber, the specific weight of it, the way she had removed herself from it, gently, the way you set something down rather than drop it. She had been right to do that. She was still right to have done that. And it had cost her something real, in the way that right choices frequently cost you something real, because the cost of a thing and the correctness of a thing were not inversely related. She was going to let that be what it was. The road opened onto a ridge, and the mid-kingdom spread out below her. Settlements, fields, the distant thread of the border river. Ordinary landscape, doing what ordinary landscape did, holding the weight of all the people who had been born on it, and worked it, and buried their dead in it, and would do all of those things again regardless of what happened in summit halls and tribunal rooms. She breathed in the cold air and let it out, and kept riding. The Luna who had died at dawn was not coming back. The woman riding south into the morning light was someone who had been forged in the months between that dawn and this one, and she was not finished being forged, and that was not a problem. That was the work. She had learned, in the hardest possible classroom, that the work was never finished, that the people who believed the work could be finished were the ones who built things like Veith's conspiracy, clean, closed, permanent. And the people who understood that the work was never finished were the ones who could outlast almost anything. She rode into the morning, and the light came up around her, and ahead the road went on.